The night my father called me just a cleaner in front of 11 relatives, I was still wearing my badge from the building I'd spent 6 years keeping spotless at 4 in the morning, the one clipped to my jacket pocket that read, Harper Quinn, Night Operations Supervisor, Brant Dynamics Tower. Nobody at that table had ever asked what the title actually meant. They'd decided years earlier that whatever I did after dark in an empty office building wasn't worth a real conversation. My father, Roland Ashworth, had spent the entire dinner talking about my younger sister Paige's promotion to executive assistant to Nathaniel Brant himself, the founder of the company whose lobby I mopped 5 nights a week without either of them ever putting the two facts together. Paige wore a new watch that cost more than my monthly rent and told a story about Nathaniel's private jet like she'd personally helped design it, describing the leather seats and the way the flight attendant had memorized her coffee order on the first trip, and my father laughed at every beat of it. The warm, easy laugh he'd stopped giving me somewhere around the year I turned 22 and came home from Afghanistan quieter than I'd left. I sat 2 seats down, cutting a piece of chicken I wasn't hungry for, listening to my aunt ask Paige whether Nathaniel Brant was as intimidating in person as he looks in interviews. Paige laughed and said he was actually very down to earth once you got past the security detail and the assistants who screened his calendar in 15-minute blocks. I thought quietly about the fact that I'd walked past Nathaniel Brant in an elevator lobby at least 40 times in the last 6 years, that I knew exactly which floor his office was on because I emptied the recycling bin outside it 3 nights a week, and that none of that had ever seemed worth mentioning at a family dinner, where the only currency that mattered was visibility. Somewhere between the second bottle of wine and Paige's third jet story, my father turned to his brother-in-law and said, loud enough for the whole table to catch, Paige works for one of the richest men in the country. Harper cleans his floors. He laughed again, that same warm sound, except this time it landed on me like a slap. Funny how 2 girls raised in the same house end up so far apart. My uncle chuckled along, not unkindly, the way people laugh at something they don't realize is cruel because the person saying it doesn't seem to think so either. My aunt glanced at me with something close to pity, the kind that stings worse than the insult itself. Paige, to her credit, looked briefly uncomfortable, opened her mouth like she might say something, then closed it again and reached for her wine glass instead. Nobody at that table had ever asked me a single question about the years I'd spent overseas, about the 2 tours, about what it had actually cost me to come home and decide that a quiet job with quiet hours was the only kind of life I could build without shattering. They'd filled in the blanks themselves, the way families often do, and the story they'd settled on was simple. Harper went to war and came back smaller. Paige stayed home and grew. I didn't argue. I never argued. Not because I didn't have the words, but because arguing had never once changed how my father decided to see me. I sat there in my uniform jacket, my hands steady around a water glass, and I thought about a folder sitting in a storage unit 40 minutes from that dinner table. A folder my father didn't know existed, containing proof of exactly how far apart Paige and I actually were, and in which direction. You're quiet tonight, Harper, my father said, not unkindly, the way you might comment on the weather. Long shift? Something like that, I said, and let the conversation move on without me, the way it always did. Before I tell you what was in that folder, and what happened 3 weeks later when Nathaniel Brant walked into a company gala and stopped dead in front of me, tell me, have you ever had a family member decide who you are before they ever bothered to ask? To understand why my father could sit across from me and call 6 years of night work nothing, you have to understand what happened before those 6 years started. I enlisted at 19, the fall after I turned down a partial scholarship to study nursing, a decision that confused everyone in my family except my mother, who understood, without me ever fully explaining it, that I needed to be useful in a way that didn't leave room for hesitation. I did 2 tours as an Army combat medic attached to an infantry unit, first in Kandahar province, later in a smaller forward operating base near the Pakistani border, and came home at 24, with a body that mostly worked and a mind that took considerably longer to catch up. My father never asked about any of it. Not the deployments, not the discharge, not the 18 months afterward when I could barely stand in a grocery store checkout line without my hands shaking, when the sound of a shopping cart hitting a curb too hard sent something cold and electric down my spine before I could talk myself back into the present moment. He'd lost his own brother in Desert Storm decades earlier, a man I'd never met, whose photograph still sat on the mantel in my parents' living room in a uniform frozen at 23 years old forever. Somewhere in that old, unprocessed grief, my father had decided the safest thing to do with a daughter who'd also gone to war was to simply stop looking at that part of her. The way you avoid a wound because touching it might reopen something you never properly closed to begin with. So when I came home and eventually took a quiet supervisory job managing the night cleaning crew at a downtown office tower, he didn't see a woman rebuilding her life on her own, careful terms. He saw confirmation of something he'd already decided, that the war had taken whatever ambition I used to have and left behind someone smaller, someone content to disappear into empty hallways after everyone else had gone home. Paige, 3 years younger, had gone the opposite direction, chasing visibility the way I'd learned to avoid it, landing internships and eventually the executive assistant role at Brand Dynamics through a combination of genuine competence and the kind of easy charm that had always come naturally to her. My father rewarded that visibility with every ounce of pride he'd quietly withheld from me, and over the years I'd stopped expecting anything different. I never corrected the story, partly because I'd stopped expecting anyone to actually listen, and partly because there was a version of the truth I hadn't told a single person in that family. That 6 years earlier, during a routine convoy ambush outside Kandahar, I'd pulled a 20-year-old private out of a burning vehicle and kept pressure on a wound in his chest for 11 minutes until a medevac helicopter finally reached us, working by instinct and training while small arms fire cracked somewhere close enough that I felt it more than heard it. And that private's name, though none of my family had ever bothered to learn it, was Nathaniel Brandt. I hadn't known, walking into that office tower for a job interview 6 years later, that the man whose name was on the building was the same private I'd once carried across a stretch of burning sand. The job had come through a veterans employment program. Unglamorous and steady, exactly the kind of anonymous work I'd been looking for. I found out 3 days into the job standing in an empty elevator lobby at 11 at night when a framed photograph near the executive floor stopped me cold. A much younger, much thinner Nathaniel in uniform, standing beside two men I recognized instantly, taken the week before the ambush that nearly killed him. I stood in front of that photograph for a long time, my cart of cleaning supplies forgotten behind me, feeling the floor of that quiet hallway tilt slightly beneath my feet. I never told anyone. Not my supervisor, not my family, not even Priya, my closest friend from my unit for almost 2 years. I told myself it wasn't my story to use, that a quiet cleaning job was exactly the anonymous, unremarkable life I'd been trying to build, and that Nathaniel Brandt, busy running a multi-billion-dollar company, had no reason to remember the face of a medic from the worst day of his life, buried somewhere under years of board meetings and product launches, and a life that had moved so far beyond that ambush it might as well have happened to a different person. What I didn't know was that he remembered everything, in the specific, unshakable way survivors remember the person who kept them alive. The turning point came, strangely enough, not from anything at the office, but from a storage unit I finally cleared out after my mother's death 6 months before that dinner. She'd passed quietly after a short illness, and in the exhausting weeks that followed, sorting through decades of accumulated belongings had fallen mostly to me, since Paige had cited work obligations, and my father had simply gone quiet the way he always did when something required more feeling than he knew how to produce. Buried in a box of my mother's old paperwork, beneath tax returns and greeting cards and a stack of recipes she'd never gotten around to organizing, was a sealed Army envelope addressed to me, postmarked 9 years earlier, forwarded to my parents' house while I was still overseas on my second tour. My mother had never given it to me. My father, going through her things after the funeral, had found it too, I later learned, read it, and said nothing, tucking it back into the box like it was something to be quietly buried alongside her, instead of something that belonged to his living daughter. I opened it alone in my car in the storage facility parking lot, my hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the January cold. It was formal notification of a Silver Star commendation, approved for my actions during the Kandahar ambush, along with a ceremony date I'd missed entirely because no one had ever told me it existed. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully settled, the formal language describing actions I remembered only as noise and heat, and the specific weight of another person's blood soaking through my gloves. 9 years late, I finally understood why my unit's old commanding officer had once mentioned, almost in passing, at a reunion I'd barely attended, that there'd been some paperwork issue with my award. An offhand comment I'd let slide past me at the time because I hadn't wanted to think too hard about that day at all. There'd been no paperwork issue. There'd been a father who couldn't look at what his daughter had survived closely enough to hand her an envelope, and a mother too gentle, or perhaps too frightened of upsetting him, to override that decision on her own. I sat with that for 3 weeks before I did anything. I didn't confront my father. I didn't tell Paige. I went to work each night, ran my crew, filed my reports, and carried that envelope folded into my jacket pocket like a second heartbeat, trying to decide what, if anything, it was supposed to mean now, nearly a decade after the fact. Eventually, I called an old friend from my unit, a benefits liaison named Priya Okonkwo, who now worked with a veterans advocacy office, and I asked her the only question that mattered. Is it too late to actually receive this? Formally? Priya was quiet on the phone for a moment before she answered, and I could hear her typing, pulling something up. It's not too late, she finally said. Delayed award ceremonies happen more often than most people realize, Harper. Paperwork gets lost. Families don't forward things. Sometimes units just fall behind. Send me everything you have and I'll start the process. She paused. Are you doing okay? This is a lot to find out 9 years late. I don't know yet, I told her honestly. Ask me again once it's real. Priya moved faster than I expected once she saw the documentation, coordinating quietly with my old unit's records office and, as it turned out, with Nathaniel Brandt's office directly, since company policy required notifying any employer hosting a formal military ceremony on their premises during work hours. That's how Nathaniel found out I worked 3 floors below his own office, cleaning the same building he ran, 6 years after I'd kept him alive on a stretch of burning road he still had nightmares about. Priya told me later that when his assistant brought him the ceremony request with my name attached, he'd gone completely still for several seconds, then canceled 2 meetings and asked to see me personally within the hour, something his assistant said she'd never seen him do before for anyone below the executive floor. I want to be honest about something. I didn't plan any of what happened next as revenge against my father. I'd stopped, somewhere in that storage unit parking lot, needing his approval enough to perform for it. What I wanted, simply, was the ceremony I'd been owed for 9 years, quietly on my own terms, in the same building where I'd spent 6 years being invisible by choice, not to punish anyone, but because some part of me needed to close a door that had been left standing open for far too long. The week before the ceremony, I ran into Paige in the elevator. Both of us there for entirely different reasons at entirely different hours, our schedules almost never overlapping. She looked at my uniform jacket, then at the badge clipped to my pocket, with a confusion I hadn't expected. You're up here a lot lately, she said carefully. Everything okay? I almost told her then. I almost handed her the whole truth right there in that elevator. The ambush, the envelope, the 9 years of silence our father had chosen. Instead, I said only, just some old paperwork finally catching up to me, and let the doors open on her floor before she could ask anything more specific. I wasn't protecting her. I think, if I'm honest, I was protecting myself, wanting to control exactly how and when this particular truth finally surfaced, instead of letting it spill out sideways in a conversation neither of us was prepared for. But my father found out about it anyway, 3 days beforehand, through Paige, who'd overheard something in an executive meeting about a private ceremony being arranged for a staff member, and, out of nothing but idle curiosity, asked around until she learned the honoree was her own sister. She called our father immediately, half laughing, assuming it was some kind of clerical mistake, some strange coincidence involving a different Harper entirely. You're not going to believe this, she reportedly told him. They think Harper's getting some kind of military award at Nathaniel's building. I don't even know how that's possible. He showed up at the ceremony uninvited, the same way he'd shown up uninvited to every version of my life he'd never once earned a seat at, standing at the back of a small conference room on the 40th floor that had been quietly transformed with a folded flag, a formal podium, and a small honor guard Priya had arranged through the local recruiting station. I saw him the moment I walked in, standing near the door in the same jacket he'd worn to that family dinner 3 weeks earlier, his face unreadable in a way I hadn't seen from him in years. The room held maybe 20 people. Priya stood near the front, along with two of my old unit mates who'd driven in for the occasion, and a scattering of Brant Dynamics executives who'd been quietly invited once word of the ceremony spread through the upper floors. I stood at attention near the podium in my dress uniform, borrowed and slightly too large in the shoulders since I hadn't worn it in years, feeling strangely exposed in a way 6 years of night shifts in an empty building had never made me feel. Nathaniel Brant walked in wearing a suit instead of the uniform I remembered, older, steadier, alive, in a way that still occasionally undid me when I let myself think about it too directly. He crossed the room and stood directly in front of me for a long moment, before saying anything at all, his eyes moving over my face like he was confirming something he already knew but still needed to see up close. "Sergeant Quinn," he said quietly, using a rank I hadn't heard attached to my name in years. "I've been trying to find the right way to say thank you for 6 years without knowing you were 3 floors below me the entire time." He read the commendation himself instead of letting an aide do it, his voice catching once on the line describing 11 minutes of continuous pressure on a chest wound while enemy fire continued around us, a detail that made two of my old unit mates near the front go very still. Then he stepped forward, pinned the star to my jacket with hands that shook slightly, steadying them against my shoulder for a moment longer than the gesture strictly required. Then he did something no one in that room, least of all my father standing frozen near the door, expected. He stepped back, squared his shoulders, and saluted me. The room went completely silent. My father's face, from what Paige told me afterward, since I couldn't see him clearly through my own sudden tears, had gone the color of old paper. He'd spent an entire dinner 3 weeks earlier laughing about how far apart his 2 daughters had ended up, never once imagining that the distance ran in a direction he hadn't bothered to look, that the daughter he'd called just a cleaner had spent 11 minutes with her hands inside another man's chest wound so that man could grow up to run the very building she'd later clean in silence. Nathaniel held the salute a full 3 seconds longer than protocol required, then lowered his hand and reached out to shake mine instead, quietly, deliberately, in front of the man who'd hidden the notification of that exact moment from me 9 years earlier. "Thank you," he said again, simply, and there was nothing performed about it. It was the kind of thank you that had clearly been sitting in him, unspoken, for 6 years. The small reception afterward was quiet, mostly people I didn't know well, offering congratulations and asking careful, respectful questions about my service, the kind of questions my own father had never once thought to ask across 9 years. Paige found me near the window at one point, her eyes red, and said only, "I didn't know. I swear to you, Harper, I didn't know any of this." And I believed her, because Paige's failure had never been cruelty, only the particular blindness of someone who'd never been given a reason to look past the surface of things. My father didn't say anything to me that day. He left before the reception properly started, slipping out while I was still shaking hands with Nathaniel's chief operating officer, and I let him go, because I hadn't done any of this to win an argument with him, and I wasn't going to chase him down the hallway to force a conversation he clearly wasn't ready to have. He called me 2 weeks later, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, thin in a way that made him sound older than I remembered. He asked if we could talk. I agreed, but only on my terms, at a coffee shop instead of the family dining room, where every previous conversation between us had been staged for an audience of relatives who never quite saw either of us clearly. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees he hadn't touched, and he stood up briefly when he saw me, an old formality I hadn't seen from him in years. "Thank you for coming," he said, and then, after a long silence, "I don't know where to start." "Start with the envelope," I said, sitting down across from him. He flinched, but he didn't argue. Didn't try to redirect the conversation the way he usually did when something got too close to a feeling he didn't want to sit inside. He told me in fragments that he'd found the letter while going through my mother's things after the ambush that nearly took me, years before her actual death, that she'd shown it to him privately, unsure what to do, and that he'd told her to simply set it aside, that he wasn't ready to have a daughter who'd nearly died the same way his brother had, That reading the details of what I'd survived had felt in some broken, illogical way, like inviting the same fate to find me again if he acknowledged it too directly. "That's not an excuse," he said quietly, staring at his untouched coffee. "I know it's not. I was afraid, and instead of being afraid honestly, I decided it was easier to just not see it, not see you. It was easier to talk about Paige's promotions and her watches and her boss's private jet than to sit across from a daughter who'd done something I couldn't even let myself imagine." I told him I appreciated the honesty and that I believed it, and that none of it erased 9 years of an envelope he'd chosen to bury instead of hand me. 9 years of dinners where I'd sat quietly while my accomplishments went unspoken and unasked about. 9 years of learning to expect nothing from him so that his indifference could never surprise me again. I told him I'd allow him back into my life slowly, on terms that didn't require me to perform smallness for his comfort ever again, and that Paige's watch and Nathaniel's building, and every other measure of visibility he'd used to rank his daughters against each other, had never once told him anything true about either of us. He nodded, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't try to talk his way past the discomfort of just sitting with what he'd done. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. I don't think either of us expected to. But it was the first honest conversation we'd had in 9 years, maybe longer. And honest, even painfully so, was worth more to me than the easy warmth he'd always saved for Paige. I still work at Brant Dynamics, though not these days at 4 a.m. with a mop. Nathaniel offered me a position in corporate security consulting once the ceremony story quietly made its way through the building, working directly with his executive protection team on threat assessment, a role that used both my medical training and instincts I'd spent years thinking I'd never need again. I accepted it on the condition that nothing about my old job be treated as something to apologize for, because it never was. I still keep my night crew's old schedule pinned above my new desk on the 40th floor, a reminder that the woman who ran that floor for 6 years was exactly as capable then as she is now, whether or not anyone in my family understood what they were looking at. My father comes to dinner sometimes now, quieter than he used to be, careful in a way that still occasionally surprises me. He doesn't tell Paige's stories at the table anymore without also asking about mine. Small, halting questions about my new work, about whether I'm sleeping better, about whether the shaking hands from all those years ago have finally settled. It isn't everything. Some old habits, some old blindness, don't fully unlearn themselves in a handful of coffee shop conversations. But it's honest. And after 9 years of an unopened envelope, honest was worth more to me than an apology ever could have been on its own. Paige and I are closer now than we've been since childhood, in a strange, unplanned way. She started asking real questions, the kind that require actual listening, and I started answering them, slowly, in pieces, the way trust usually rebuilds after it's been left unattended for too long. She told me once, almost shyly, that she'd started telling people at work a different story now. Not about Nathaniel's private jet, but about her sister, the medic, the one who'd kept her boss alive on a road none of them had ever had to think about before. Sometimes, late at night, old habits pull me back toward that downtown tower anyway, even though I don't need to be there anymore. I'll take the elevator up just to walk the floor I used to clean, past the photograph near the executive level that first stopped me cold 3 days into that job. The young, unrecognized version of a man who would one day salute me in front of the father who'd spent 9 years refusing to see what I'd survived. I don't need the reminder anymore, not really. But some nights I stand there anyway, just to remember how far a person can travel between being called nothing at a dinner table and being saluted by someone who owes you his life, and how much of that distance, in the end, was never about proving anything to anyone at all. If someone in your life has ever decided who you were before they bothered to ask, I hope you remember this. The people who measure your worth by the job title on your badge usually aren't looking closely enough to see what you actually carried to get there. And sometimes the truth doesn't need you to argue for it. Sometimes it just needs enough time and the right room to finally stand up on its own.